Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 7, Lesson 3, all about Greece and Persia. So, you may remember we talked about the Persians before. The Persians were from southwestern Asia. Today, that would be southwestern Iran. They had background similar to like we've talked about before, originally cattle herders and things, and then they came in and settled. Um, and they end up being a really powerful kingdom once they join together. So we've talked about Cyrus the Great before. Around 500 BC, he makes this big empire. He builds a really strong army and makes, at the time, the largest empire in the ancient world. So we talked about this a little bit when we said, the Persians came in and they took over Mesopotamia and Syria and Judah and even the Greek city states that were on the coast, right? That area that we called Anatolia. So they come taking over and making this kingdom. And you may remember that Cyrus was the one who allowed the Jews to return from Babylon. He was like one of the nicer ones, right? That he let them go back home, and he let a lot of the conquered people keep a lot of their identity, right? Their language and their religion and things, even though he, of course, is still going to rule them. Okay, so that's a quick review. So at this time, we're going to go on from there then. After Cyrus, they expand even farther and they get into Egypt and Western India and parts of Greece, northeastern Greece. And they have this very large empire. And the reason that they were able to, they were smart about how they ran things to make it run efficiently, even though it's huge. One of them is by taking that network of roads that we talked about when we talked about the Assyrians, and they improve it. And you can see by the map that it becomes very long. This was called the Royal Road. Obviously, it's more of a road network, and it's about 1,500 miles long, right? Going all the way across from Persia to Anatolia. So the advantage, just like when we talked about with the Assyrians, that the travelers could stop and get things they needed, fresh horses, food and water, and messengers can get messages across the empire quickly, which is going to be very important, right, for efficiency. And so once they made this efficient network, the messengers can get from Anatolia to Persia in only 7 days, which is much faster. It used to take them 3 months to travel that. So that's going to be smart for running an efficient empire. But of course, it is difficult. And so one of the later kings, Darius the First, he actually decided, you know what, we need to break it up. Not completely, but how it's run. So he broke it into provinces that were called satrapies. And a person named a satrap, it's like a governor, would run each of those smaller areas. And the satrap would collect the taxes, hear all the legal cases, manage the police, responsible for getting soldiers for your area. So definitely, smart to have someone ruling the smaller areas and then, of course, reporting to Darius. The other thing that they changed is they made a full-time professional army. Remember, this is different than what is normally done in Greece, for example. Remember that they are citizen soldiers that are just called up when they need them in times of war. So having a full-time professional army is going to be very important. They even had a special group called the Immortals, were the 10,000 best soldiers, and their job was to guard the king. And they're called the Immortals because whenever one of them died, another one quickly took the place of it. So it was like it seemed like it was no effect, right? So that's why they seemed immortal, because it was always perfectly filled. Okay, so the other thing we need to talk about is just different about the Persians is their religion. So at first, the Persians were polytheistic, like most people were at this time, right? But there was someone, Zoroaster was a religious teacher who decided or started preaching monotheism. And I'm just putting the dates every once in a while just so you kind of have an idea where we are. You don't have to memorize all these. Um, but he said it was going to be monotheistic, and there was one supreme god, Ahura Mazda. Okay. Ahura Mazda means wise Lord. And so over time, the main ideas of Zoroastrianism is basically like there is evil in the world, but people can choose between good and evil, and they believe that all the forces of good are going to win in the end. Okay. Um, so over time, they started to believe that the king, the monarch, got his power from the will of the god, right? The god approved and kind of worked through him. So we've talked about that similar idea before, right? Like the Egyptians thought that. So this changes over time that the Persians now believe they have God's will for them to rule. And so it's a supreme ruler, right? Um, and this religion is still around today. Most of it is in Southern Asia, so you don't hear about it quite as much here in the United States, but still, 200,000 people is not a tiny group. Okay, so the next thing I want to switch over to is start talking about the Persians, of course, have this real huge empire, and they are, like most of the rulers at the time, wanting to keep increasing it. Remember that they are taking over these different areas. One area was in Anatolia. Now, remember, the Greeks do not believe that they should be ruled by some all-powerful king. Most of the Greeks believe that they should have some say in choosing their rulers. So it's not going to go well. Anatolia is going to resist and not like that the Persians are controlling it. And the other Greeks, right, in the area don't like that this part of that their area is being taken over by the Persians. And you got to imagine they see it as a threat to them too, right? So when the Greeks are trying to revolt in Anatolia, the Athenians and some others sent warships to go try to help them in throwing off the Persian rule. Of course, the Persians are extremely powerful, and so they crush the uprising, and the king, Darius, is so angry that the other Greeks, right, have interfered in his business, and he vows he's going to come and take over the rest of, the Greek mainland. So, get back at Athens for helping. So, the first battle we need to talk about is the Battle of Marathon. I'm going to make this really, a shortened version, but basically, Darius does send like 600 ships over there, and he expects the Greeks, he lands in a place near the plain of Marathon, and he expects the Greeks to come and fight him. And the Athenians, of course, know that the Persians have a much larger army than they do. So they don't immediately meet the Persians, and the Persians wait for days, and they accounts differ, but basically the short story is they do decide to start loading their cavalry back onto their ships, and they're going to go maybe sail around to Athens directly and attack Athens directly. So that is when the Athenians decide to attack. Once the cavalry is already back on board the ships. Cavalry, remember, are the ones, the soldiers on horseback that have an advantage, and only the Persian foot soldiers are left, and then they're probably also not ready to fight if they've been loading people up. They could be even just out in the water, getting ready to get out in the smaller boats out to the large ones. And they're definitely out of formation and without their best fighters, the cavalry. So it was smart of the Athenians to wait to attack now because they have about half as many soldiers. they estimate about 10,000 Athenian soldiers to 20,000 Persians. Um, so to make a long story short, the Athenians are able to win. Also, the hoplites were known to be good hand-to-hand fighters once they did get the opportunity. So by waiting till it was a better situation for them probably helped. So to make a long story short, the Athenians win. Now, there's a legend I'm sure you have heard of about a marathon race. Okay. Now, it's a legend. In fact, we think that some of the history that was written down actually got confused by different writers, and you know, it could be different people running. It was common to have messengers run. But anyway, regardless, the legend that goes with this is that supposedly a messenger is sent from the plains of Marathon back about 25 miles to Athens to tell Athens that they beat the Persians, and he supposedly said victory, and then he died. A lot of people disagree if that's really what happened, but regardless, it's a legend, right? And of course, we have the marathon races are named after this event. Okay. All right. So the Persians are they had left to fight another day, right? After the Athenians beat them. The story goes on a little bit more, right? The Athenians have to hightail it back to try to protect Athens when the ships are coming around. They had been waiting for Sparta to come back them up, but Sparta had been, busy with some religious festivals, and so they couldn't come yet. So anyway, they do hightail it back, and so long story short, the Persians do not finish their invasion at that time, and then of course Darius vows that he's going to take revenge on them again and continue, but they're distracted because the Egyptians that they control are revolting, and so Darius has to focus his energies on putting down that revolt, and then he actually dies, and it's his son Xerxes who ends up putting down that Egyptian revolt, and then finally around 480 decides to again, okay, well, now we're going to go back and conquer the Greeks again and take our revenge. And so he does invade Greece with like 200,000 troops and thousands of warships. So all the Greek city-states are going to band together to try to fight off this outside invasion, which is a pretty big thing, remember, because the Greeks are very independent and fight amongst themselves a lot. So the fact that they're willing to work together to combat this foreign enemy is a pretty big deal. Okay, so there's some famous people. Some of these, especially if you've watched the movie 300, some of you know some of these stories, but King Leonidas of Sparta is, of course, going to kind of be in charge of leading the soldiers and supplies most of the soldiers, because we know that's what Sparta is, right? Themistocles is a person in Athens who's given the direction of the naval forces, and he devises the battle plan, so he's pretty famous in this. And we're going to make a long story short. There's obviously more battles than we have time for, and I'm not a huge battle person, so we just kind of talk about the major highlights. So in this one, the Battle of Thermopylae, there's a traitor who tells the Persians of a way around the Greek lines, and it becomes clear that the Persians are going to be able to surround the Greek soldiers. And so the Spartans get a lot of attention in this battle of Thermopylae because Leonidas says, okay, quickly, the rest of you go ahead and get out while you can, because we're going to end up getting surrounded, and you need to go and help, for in future things. So he and 300 Spartans stay and fight to the death to try to delay the Persians. So if you've seen the movie 300 or you've heard about it, this is what that is talking about. So that gives Themistocles time to go ahead and carry out the rest of his plan. And that is, of course, going to be a naval battle, and that's at the Strait of Salamis. And so this is a strait, remember, is a narrow channel of water between two pieces of land. So it's narrow, and so he's luring the battle on purpose because the Persians have much bigger, heavier, harder to maneuver ships than the Greeks. And the Greeks, of course, have less. So they need to use every advantage they can. So they do lure him into this battle, and it works. The Greeks' ships are faster and able to maneuver around in this small area better than the Persians. And the long story short is that the Persians, most of their ships are destroyed. And so Athens wins this battle, although, in the meantime, right, the rest of the soldiers had been successfully eventually get to Athens. And by this time, most of Athens is empty. People have left, but they go ahead and set fire to Athens, right? So it's not like total wins, but they did do well in that battle. Okay, and some long story short. So how does this end? So another famous one, Plataea, is a battle. I'm going to make it really short. So the Greeks have really worked on working together by now. We're about 479 BC by now. And they made some better weaponry and armor, and their numbers are about even with the Persians now. Okay, about 100,000 each. And in this last battle, the Persians lose. So basically, this is the beginning of the end of the decline for Persia. The Greeks go on and they go to Anatolia and they free them, right, from the rule of the Persians. And the empire, the Persians eventually, give up and stop fighting and trying to control the Greeks. But it's not until about 449 that this actually happens. So think how long they've been, fighting. It's crazy how long these battles last, or these wars. But Persia itself is starting to decline, right? They are not able to control their really large empire after a while. They've probably, been too thin. Also, people are getting unhappy because of the high taxes to pay for not only all these wars and things, but they're unhappy that they see all the luxuries and palaces and nice things that they have to pay for, right? So they're getting unhappy about that. Then the royal family themselves are disagreeing about who should rule. So whenever there's internal struggles or weakness, that leaves them open to other people. So basically, this is when, in around the 300s, Alexander the Great comes to power, and he invades and takes over Persia's empire. And he is going to make, and we mentioned him before, right, Alexander the Great, and we are going to talk about him more in the future. And he is going to end up making that huge new Greek empire and extend it even farther than the Persians had. So it's going to be the new biggest empire. We'll talk about that in the future.